Was Gandalf really just a 5th level wizard? When did witches first appear in Dungeons and Dragons? When did the Ankheg debut? And what about the first massively multiplayer game of Dungeons and Dragons? Well, we're going to talk about all of that and more today on Daddy Rolled a One. Today's video is once again sponsored by me and my new book kickstarting on June 3rd called Alchemy, Explosions, and Inventions. It's all about playing expert and specialist characters and also provides information for referees to add experts and specialists to their campaigns. It's designed for old school essentials, but it's really going to work with any kind of class and level fantasy adventure game, particularly ones that were from the old school style. So it's going to be available as both a PDF and a print on demand. And I have a new announcement to make, which is that I'm also going to be offering an upgrade to a hardcover version that's going to have a brand new cover that my designer and artist friend is working on as we speak. So there's going to be various different pledge levels, and you'll also have the choice to choose between a plain white background for easier reading or a classic parchment style background. So if you would like to learn more, please sign up for my pre-launch Kickstarter page. The link is down below, so you'll be notified when the product goes live on Kickstarter. Thank you so very much for your support. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons. So today I'm going to be talking about Dragon Magazine's issues number 4 and 5 from December of 1976 and March of 1977, respectively, that is. But first, I want to go over 4 specific topics that you may have seen in a thumbnail, or I also mentioned in an introduction, and I want to make sure that I go over those first in case that's why you came here. So I'm going to quickly go over, not in order. So these are the order that these were published, but I'm going to talk about the idea that Gandalf was only a 5th level magic user. I'm going to talk about the first witches that appear in Dungeons and Dragons, at least in TSR published stuff. Then we're going to talk a little bit about, very briefly, the debut of the Ankheg, a classic D&D creature. Still part of the game today, over almost 50 years later. And then lastly, an interesting look at the first sort of, you could call it the tabletop version of a massive multiplayer role-playing game, not online, obviously, back in these days. So there's an interesting thing that we're going to look at as far as the development of that kind of playing. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. However, I would like to recommend that when I'm done with those 4 topics that you stick around, because after that, I am going to start going through the magazines kind of in order. We're going to talk about the creators, the cover, the artists, and you're going to get a real look at the foundational history of this hobby coming out of these articles and letters and things that are being written. So each magazine is really only about 32 pages long, so it's not going to be too long of a thing to sit through, but I highly recommend that you stick around for that. But that said, let's go ahead and start by looking at this article that Gandalf was only a 5th level magic user. So I'm trying something a little new this time with my recording. Normally, when I'm looking at these old magazines, I'm just doing a screen record. But someone mentioned before in one of those past ones that my audio sounded a little different and not as good when I did that, as opposed to when I do my other videos when I'm recording my phone. So I am doing this one where I'm recording on my phone and on my screen at the same time, and then I'll use the audio from my phone. So let me know if you prefer this. It's a little bit more of a hassle to set up, but I'm hoping that the audio quality will be better. So in any event, this is the article that I'm talking about right here. Gandalf was only a 5th level magic user. And I'm going to just enlarge the size to make it a little bit easier for us to look at. So this is written by a gentleman by the name of Bill, I'm going to say Seligman. I did try to look up to see if Bill kind of continued writing anything in the role-playing game industry. I couldn't find anything by him. But that said, this article alone is like enough to kind of make him famous, or you could almost say infamous, I guess. So this article is written, as you see here, in March of 1977, and it is still being talked about today. So when I was doing my research for this, I found people like on forums over on EN World, I think on Reddit, as recently as just like a few years ago, where people are still referencing this article. So again, the guy got a little bit of infamy from writing this. So I'm not going to get into too much of the actual, I'm not going to argue about whether this guy's correct or not, because quite honestly, I'm not really a big Tolkien scholar. I've read the books and, I've seen the movies many, many times, but I'm not sure that I'm qualified to disagree with this person. But plenty of people have. So basically, this is now almost what you would call a clickbait article these days. And that's a reason why I used it in my thumbnail. So, but let's get into it. So he says, it's impossible. Gandalf was at least 30th, 40th, or even 50th level because, he says that he was an Astari. Okay, so he talks about that, and he was living over 2,000 years. So how can he only be 5th level? And what he does is he backs into it by basically describing the powers that Gandalf uses, his spells, and puts them into D&D terms. So there is some kind of fun things in here when he talks about, his fancy colored smoke rings are just like, a variant of pyrotechnics or phantasmal force. Tricking the trolls is ventriloquism. Lightning bolts is, a 3rd level spell, which be cast by a 5th level magic user. And then he keeps going on. And then he talks about, okay, look at here at number 6. He says, making pine cones catch fire and tossing them down upon the wargs from a tree, a variant on fireball, pyrotechnics, and even the druid spell produce flame. So what's interesting about that is that it's kind of coming full circle to how fireball came about, because the first person to play a wizard, to role play a wizard, was in Blackmore, Dave Arneson's Blackmore, and predating D&D. So this is, 1970, maybe 1971. Player's name was Pete. Was it Pete Gaylord or Bill Gaylord? I want to say Pete Gaylord. Again, I should have looked that up, but I just mentioned him. But he's the first wizard player. I'm going to say Pete Gaylord. And unlike some of the other characters or roles or archetypes that Dave Arneson assigned to people, like to Dave McGarry, he assigned Dave McGarry to play a thief. He assigned Mike Carr to play a cleric. Pete Gaylord asked Dave Arneson if he could be a wizard, and Dave Arneson said yes, and they kind of had to figure out how this worked. And one of the things that happened in one of the games is that Pete Gaylord said, I'm going to throw essentially what we now call a fireball spell. I'm going to cast that and throw this ball of fire at, whoever he was fighting. And Dave Arneson had to figure out how the mechanics of that worked. Now, Pete Gaylord came up with that idea partially from having read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and knowing that Gandalf did that. So the idea of like setting the pine cone on fire and throwing that was the inspiration partially for the spell fireball. And then this guy here is talking about and saying it like almost like backwards, like the idea that, and this guy knows that this, Bill Seligman, who wrote this article, he knows that Tolkien exists prior to D&D, but he makes it sound as though the spells in Tolkien are based on D&D spells. And again, that wasn't his intent. It's just the way that he writes the article. But in any event, we'll continue. So he just goes through and talks all about like things like tossing Sauron out of Dol Guldur, and he says, well, that's not even Sauron as an individual, so like you can't even really look at that. And then he says, oh, also Sauron is at most 7th or 8th level. So, and then he gets, because that's all the Hobbit stuff. Then he gets into the Fellowship of the Ring, and he just talks again about more spells that Gandalf casts in those books into 3, and how they map to D&D spells and what those levels of spells would be. So just going along, flames fighting the wargs, lighting the way in Moria, fighting the Balrog, lightning bolts, and then he talks about bursting into flame Legolas's arrows when he comes back from the dead, and Legolas shoots at him, and awakening Theoden, which is a combination of he says lightning, light, and darkness, which is, I think that's a stretch about how what he's saying there, but okay, whatever. And then he talks about charm person spells, And sorry about that. And then he talks about also a spell. He's referencing alarms and excursions. Number 12. We've talked about alarms and excursions before, but if you're not familiar, that was a very, very early D&D fanzine. It might even be like, well, I'll just say it's one of the first. I can't remember if it's exactly the first, but published out here in California. Lee Gold was one of an early adopters of Dungeons and Dragons, and she started publishing this very, very early, and it was very. I guess you could call it famous within the community back then as being, an area where people would share ideas, and many people that go on to create games or people that were already creating games at TSR. Gary Gygax published articles in Alarms and Excursions as an example. So it was really well known for kind of developing talent or getting good talent already to like publish stuff. So in any event, he's referencing that there's a spell in there called Fire Beam that looked like it was similar to a spell that Gandalf uses. Okay. And then he said, and that's it. So he goes through essentially book by book and says, this is every power that Gandalf uses and why those spells are lower level than people might think. Fun cartoon over here on the right hand side by Tom Wham. So in an earlier video, I accidentally referred to him as Tom Wham because I had never heard his name pronounced before. So it looks like Wham, but it's pronounced Wham. And I didn't know that. So thanks to the user who pointed that out to me. I appreciate you. The viewer who commented. All right. So anyway, he goes on through here and he talks about the Balrog and then he says, well, that's a fault with the D&D combat system. So again, people have been doing this forever. I remember when the Fellowship of the Ring movie came out in 2001, and that was right after 3rd edition D&D had come out. And there's the scene at the end of the movie where Aragorn is fighting the orcs and and Frodo and Sam kind of run away. And there's that all the orcs are chasing there. And there's a scene where Aragorn is fighting the orcs and he just does like hit after hit after hit on the orcs before they even get a chance to hit back at him. And of course, that's done for narrative purposes. It looks great on screen and it shows you like how good of a fighter Aragorn really is. And all these people are like, well, that's impossible because in D&D, he'd have to be X level to get that many attacks per round. And the orcs like never get a chance and like how blah, blah, blah. I was like, it's because it's not based on D&D. And it's just like people get so caught up in this kind of stuff of trying to take fictional properties and figure out how they work in D&D. And the thing is, they don't. It's because they're fiction. They weren't created with game rules in mind. But in any event, I mean, it's a fun exercise. It's fun to like try to stretch it and figure out how to back into it. But, to say that it's impossible that he should have been able to do that is kind of silly, at least to me. So anyway, he goes on talking about here. He references the Eldritch Wizardry supplement, which had come out by this time. So again, this magazine, issue number 5, is published in March of 1977. So by this time, Eldritch Wizardry has been published in 1976. So then he says, okay, as for Sauron, without going into too much detail, Sauron's powers are clairvoyance, ESP, and perhaps an advanced wizard's eye. With much longer ranges that's described in D&D. But since he has the Palantir, maybe he let that thing do most of the work for him. And so if you're going to be nasty, you could say he could have control weather, which would make him be 12th level. But he kind of backs in and says it's probably more like 6th or 7th or 8th level. And he says, well, how do we reconcile our intuition with bare facts? For one thing, as I hinted above, the universe of Lord of the Rings is magic weak. He says that. And it's actually kind of true depending on how you want to define magic. I mean, it's compared to something like a modern fantasy, like a Forgotten Realms or something like that, sort of, the post D&D fantasy genre all kind of took a turn where it skewed very high magic because that's one of the things that people sort of liked about D&D, I think. And so a lot of fantasy starts to kind of follow that. Now, it's not always true. I would argue that Game of Thrones, the Song of Ice and Fire series, is magic weak in the tradition of Tolkien, but that's also partially because George R.R. Martin was inspired by Tolkien's work when he was working on Game of Thrones. So That's low magic. I'd say like the Black Company books by Glenn Cook are low magic. But there's plenty of high magic stuff out there. But he says Tolkien is low magic. And he says, so it's easy to assume that it was run by a very tough DM who awarded experience so slowly that it would take 2,000 years for a pseudo angel to get to the 5th level and 6,000 years or more for an evil high priest to reach 12 level, evil high priest being Sauron. And he says, however, I would still place the blame on the scale we're using the D&D magic system. It seems more likely thing for Gygax and Arson to misjudge the spell levels. Okay. I'm not sure I agree with that. So what can we do? Change the spell system, or you change the experience system of the level spells, or all of the above. So again, I guess he's trying to make D&D closer to what is shown in Tolkien. And I think that that's just an exercise in futility. The D&D game is based on so many other sources than Tolkien. And we've talked about that many, many times, but there's so many other elements that go into the game. I mean, I just talked about this recently where Dave Arneson was putting stuff from like Star Trek and Dark Shadows into his games. So to try to say like, oh, we need to change the D&D spell system or experience system to be more like Tolkien, I think is kind of silly. All right. And then what's really funny here is that the editor, who again is Tim Kask, he says down here at the bottom, please address your responses to Out on a Limb. I think he was expecting that a lot of people were going to write in and kind of complain about this. Now, what's interesting is he says Out on the Limb, that's the letters column that people would write in. And we're going to talk about a few of those in a second here. But after this issue, Out on the Limb disappears from Dragon Magazine for, I think it doesn't come back until, I want to say issue 23 or 24, something like that. It's a really long time. So by the time it comes back, I think people weren't really talking about this anymore. I tried to look for, scan the issues that I have and see if it had ever come up, but I just think that it had been too long. So I'm not sure why they didn't publish Out on the Limb for such a long time, but by the time that they do, this article was like years old at that point. And so I just think that it wasn't really relevant anymore, I guess. But like I said, it is something that is still talked about. This is one of the articles. It's just a short one page. It's not even a full page because the cartoon at the bottom, it is one of the things that gets reprinted in Best of Dragon Volume 1. So it had legs. So that's where I actually first saw this article, was in Best of Dragon Volume 1. I was not playing D&D, didn't even know what the game was when this magazine came out in 1977. So I discovered it in the early 80s in Best of Dragon Volume 1, which I have a video where I talk about that. And so because of that, I think that's where a lot of people saw it, because the early 80s is when, the population of the game players exploded. And so that's part of the reason why I think this article had so much attention and so many people are aware of it even now, like, 40 years later or whatever, because of that being reprinted in Best Dragon Volume 1, and also because it's a very controversial topic and it makes for, people want to argue about it. All right, now we're going to cover this article on witches. This is also from Dragon Magazine, issue number 5, March 77. So you see here, it's the Witchcraft Supplement for Dungeons and Dragons. And then the editor, again, this is Tim Kask, he writes this note here at the top and he says, we received this MS, I guess he means message. We received this, it's an article, over 15 months ago and have been unable to establish the identity of the author. If he or she is reading this, please step forward and receive your just reward. Now, I didn't look too much into the future issues if this ever comes out, but like on the Dragon Dex, which is the online sort of index of Dragon Magazine, this article is still attributed to Anonymous. So I'm not sure that the person who wrote this ever did like I said, come forward and get their credit for this article, which is too bad because it's very in depth. It's quite long. So now again, I am going to increase, I just wanted you to see the page spread and the layout here, but I'm going to increase the size. So just make it a little bit easier to read as we scroll through. And again, we're not going to go through the whole thing here, but just the idea of how the person approaches the subject of witches. And so one of the things that is interesting about this is that they're not presented as a character class. They're presented as a monster. And so it talks about, from the mist of time, the full story of witchcraft and okay, blah, blah, blah. And then it says, I'm looking at the second paragraph here. It says, since no witches appear on the wilderness encounter chart, assume on a die of roll of 5 or 7, there will be witches present 50% of the time, and the chart's indicated monster on the other 50%, which implies 2 die rolls. The number of witches encountered will be a factor of terrain, as they were best suited to certain environments and favored the woodlands and orchards most of all. Now, what he's talking about here specifically, because again, you have to remember at this point, March of 77, there is only one version of Dungeons and Dragons, and it is what we would now call the original version, original D&D, OD&D, or sometimes people will now call it 0E, like 0 edition. Okay, but he's talking about that game, and in this Wilderness Encounter chart he's referring to is in volume 3 of the original box set, and Underwater and Wilderness Adventures, and there's the Wilderness Encounter tables you can see here. And so what he's talking about is there's no witches listed on there, and in order to fill them in, because in the old days what you did as a dungeon master when you first started, or at the time as a referee, when you were running an encounter that was going to take place in the wilderness, you got these tables out from your book and you rolled to see what was there. Unlike now where everything is kind of already done for you if you get a published adventure, or sometimes you'll write your own and you'll figure out what's going to go where. Well, in the old days when you were writing your own, you rolled on these charts because everything was, theoretically mathematically based, so that, certain types of things would show up more often because those are the types of things that you're more likely to encounter in these types of areas. And so you would roll on the tables and you would stock your encounter, either your dungeon or your wilderness areas in that particular way. So it's just a shorthand way of explaining it. It's a little more complicated than that, but essentially that's what this is referring to. So if you want a witch in a game, they would have to come up randomly because you're going to put them on this table. You're going to revise these tables and put witches in so they can come up. And then he talks about they can be either lawful or chaotic. Mostly they're going to be chaotic. However, there's no neutral witches. And then he said, if a group is found to be chaotic, the order of every witch must be checked individually with a 12-sided die. This gets very, very complicated. So there's a lot of number rolling here to figure out, like, are they high order or low order? Or are they part of the forbidden secret order? And if they are, then they all have to be part of the forbidden secret order. And it's really an interesting approach. And again, very numbers heavy. Okay, so then he goes on and says, there's a table down here to tell you the number of appearing mountains, deserts, rivers, swamps, clear towns, and woods. And then their armor class, their movement in inches, because again, remember the reason it's in inches is because this was based on the idea that you've got figures moving around on a map and that each figure can move a certain number of inches per round or per turn, based on, whether you're in, combat or not in combat. And so that's all based on, measuring this out in inches to make sure that you weren't trying to cheat and move too far. Okay. What their hit dice was, and then their treasure type. And again, this is another thing where you rolled the treasure back then. Each monster type had its own treasure table that you rolled on to see what you got. Then it gets into like witch magic. And it says that witchcraft, including those spells which resemble clerical or wizard spells, don't affect Gene, Efreet, or clerics of any alignment. So if you're a cleric, you're totally safe from witch magic, which is really interesting. And then he splits it up, or he or she, again, we don't know who wrote this article, splits it up into white witchcraft and gives their spells. Okay, and then gets into going up to the top here, more spells. And there's some new spells in here, which is kind of cool. So if you're reading this and you're a referee, you're getting new spell ideas. But also if you're a player, you might want to try to convince your referee or your DM that you want to use one of these spells. Then there's priestess witchcraft. And so when you see here, it says, as with the patriarch. So that's referring to level titles for clerics. So again, remember at this time, every edition, well, up until second, because second didn't have these, but, all the early editions had level titles. We've talked a little bit about those before. So a patriarch, I forget which level of cleric that is, but that's the level of cleric that is able to cast a cure disease spell. And then it says anti-magic shell, as with a wizard. It's same thing. So wizard in this case doesn't mean a class, because the class was called magic user. Wizard is the name for a high level magic user, depending on which level it was. Probably 9, I'm assuming. I just don't remember off the top of my head. But you have all these different spells and abilities. Okay. And then you've got your black witchcraft. Sorry, that's bouncing around like that, guys. So just because I increased the size to make it easier to read. But sorry, I'm going to go back here. So all your different levels of spells, again, that you have. I talked about Black Witchcraft. And then you've got your different magic items, your serpent belts, your seed satchels, your hornet capes, all that kind of stuff, witch layers and treasure. Okay, so we talked a little bit about that. And then witch items. So this article goes on for quite a while. It's pretty long. Okay. And then it's even continued here on page 28. So it doesn't even finish here. So I'm going to scroll back a little bit just so we can kind of see how long this article is. So, I mean, just look at this. Like, look how much detail is in here. This took this person a very long time to write this article, did a lot of research. And then, like, there's the weapons of the Secret Witch Order. And then there's some more art here. Let's see if we can figure out who that is by. JDW. I'm not sure who that is. Apologies. If you know, drop it in the comments. But it's also the same person that did this piece of art here. I remember that from before. Okay, so, and then it says it continues on page 28. So let's go to page 28. And you'll see here, it's this section on research. Nope, sorry, it's this section here on covens. So covens from page 9. So you're getting the witch covens, and it talks about crystal mirrors and amulets of power and things like that. So again, a really interesting approach to the article. Now, what I think is interesting about this, particularly, other than the amount of research that it went into it, and it was probably pretty usable because it looks pretty detailed in terms of the amount of work going into figuring out how this would all fit in together in a D&D game. But again, you see this here. This is March of 1977. Now, by this point in D&D, in the Strategic Review, which was the predecessor publication to The Dragon, you see here it's called The Dragon. So in the Strategic Review, you have the debut of some new classes, which were not in order. I don't remember the order that they were published, but there was Rangers, Illusionists, and Bards. All three of those were published in the Strategic Review, and all three of them end up being part of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, then in Dragon Magazine, issue number 2 had an alchemist class. We did talk about that before. And then issue 3 had some like joke classes. There was the idiot class, but there was also the jester class. So there have been classes in here before. So, and again, the witch is not a class. The reason I'm bringing this up is, again, this is March of 77. Now, in July of 77, we're going to get the publication of a new version of D&D, which they called Basic D&D. And this is the Holmes Basic set, the blue box, blue cover. And you see this little snippet here. So this is in the section on classes that are described in the Holmes Basic rulebook, and it's talking about how that rulebook only has the very basic classes. It's got cleric, fighter, magic user, and thief. Okay, and then it's talking about a little bit here, like if you want to play, there's a section where it talks about if you want to play a thief that's an elf, dwarf, or hobbit, you have to look into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons because the rules for doing that will be in there. So this rulebook's going to assume if you're playing a thief that you're playing a human thief. Okay, so you see this section here, though, in this paragraph, and it talks about how if you move from Holmes Basic, because Holmes Basic only covers the first 3 levels. It covers levels 1, 2, and 3. You have to, if you want to go past that, starting with level 4, you have to refer to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And it says in here specifically that you, in Advanced D&D, you're going to get new options. And so it talks about things like Paladins and Rangers, which were in these supplements for, Paladin was in the Greyhawk supplement. Ranger was in Strategic Review. It talks about Assassins, which were in and Monks, and those were both in the Blackmore supplement. And then it talks in here and see it says Illusionists. Again, we know that was in Strategic Review. And then it says Witches. Now, at this point, to my knowledge, there had not been published a witch class for D&D, at least in like the mainstream stuff. There might have been one in a zine, like Alarms and Excursions, things like that. Very possible. But as far as something that was going to get major distribution, was published by TSR, there had not been a witch. So he says that, the editor of the Holmes Basic Set, Eric J. Holmes, says there will be a witch subclass to Magic User in Advanced D&D. And I've always wondered if he was inspired to write that based on this article coming out. Now, it's also possible that Gary Gygax just told him, hey, I'm making a witch class, and that's going to be part of the rules. And then it just never made it in there. But I don't know why. I've never seen anywhere else where Gary says that. So I'm not sure where this little clip comes from, this little snippet about witches being in Advanced D&D. I just think it's interesting timing wise, and it could just be a complete coincidence that, again, we have this witchcraft supplement here in Dragon Magazine number 5. All right, now let's go to the third piece that we wanted to discuss early on, which is the debut of the Ankheg, the very classic, iconic D&D monster, also in issue number 5. So actually everything we're going to talk about in this upfront part is coming from issue 5. But I just wanted to cover both issues together, 4 and 5, because there's just not enough for a video if I dedicated one video just to each issue. So here we see the Ankheg, however you want to pronounce it, here on the left-hand page. This is the featured creature. So this was a ongoing column in Dragon Magazine that started pretty early on, where they tried to debut new monsters in here. So we've talked about this before, the Remoras. However, again, there's multiple ways you can pronounce that. Debuted in an earlier issue. We did talk about that before. And now here we have the Ankheg. Now, art here is done by Errol Otis. And again, I really think that he's the correct choice for doing these weird alien almost looking things with lots of tentacles and pieces. This is obviously very insect-like. And I just, his style of art matches this perfectly. So again, I'm going to increase the page size so that we can see it a little bit easier. So again, here's that art. Now, here we go with looking at the stats. So number appearing, description, armor class. Remember, these are the days where of descending armor class, so lower is better. So it has a 2 overall. But if you're able to get underneath it, it's a 4. So easier to hit if you're underneath, because that's the 4 is actually worse than the 2. Okay, and then it's got the movement, the hit die, the percent in layer, treasure. Now, B2, that's referring to which treasure table are you going to refer to figure out, in the rule book, which one are you going to roll on to figure out what kind of treasures in there. And then it talks about it can squirt acid, and it's got a bite, magic resistance, none, and its alignment is neutral. And that says continued on page 28. So very, and it's just partly due to the layout that they were able to do at the time. Remember that this is not being done on computers or, with desktop publishing. This is being done by hand. It's called paste up. They're laying it out by hand, where they have each article and they're having to cut them, like the typed pages, and arrange them with the art and figure out how they can fit them on the page so that they can flow. So you almost never see anymore, if you're reading a magazine, something that says like, continued, 20 pages later or whatever, because they will just lay it out the way that they need to get everything to fit within a page or a spread or whatever that is. So it's very uncommon to have to skip anymore to read. But back in the day, it was very, very common. Which makes it really frustrating if you're trying to use this thing, because here's your stats, here's your picture, and then we're going to go to page 28, because it said, again, it's continued on page 28. I'm having a bit of a lag here, and here we are on page 28. And then this is the description of what the creature is right here on the left. So, burrowing through the earth like an earthworm, blah, 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 right? So everything that you need to know about what the creature is and what it eats and, how it behaves in combat and things like that is all the way over here. And then again, the stats were before. But that is the debut of this creature, again, that's been part of Dungeons and Dragons. Well, obviously since it debuted here, but makes its way into the Monster Manual and becomes a core part of the game, debuting all the way here in Dragon Magazine number 5. Now, unfortunately, this one, there's no, as you saw, there is no credit as to who created this. And we have the artist, but it doesn't say who wrote it. Now the magazine's edited by Tim Kask. It's possible that he's the one that created this. There are other creatures where they actually do credit who did it. In this particular case, it doesn't say. And again, if you look on the Dragon decks, it's not credited to anybody. So, I guess we just have to guess. But I do think, from what I recall, I think a lot of these early monsters were actually created by Tim Kask, even though he's editing the magazine. All right, but that's our look at the Ankheg. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is actually going to be a letter from a subscriber, a reader of Dragon Magazine, that appears here in Out on a Limb. So we talked about this just briefly, but this is, again, going to be the last time this column shows up for quite a while. I'm going to say years. All right. But the specific one I want to talk about is this one here. So again, I'm going to increase the size a little bit just to make it easier for you guys to read. Also makes it easier for me to read because my eyes aren't what they used to be. Okay. So this article starts out and it says, Dear Mr. Kask, I would like to tell you about the massive campaign that I've been working on. It is situated on a hypothetical world of, I'm going to say Loera, a world of infinite possibility in fantastic adventure. Although it is not our own Earth, it is only about 11 light years from our world, and therefore most of the culture is a parallel of our ancient cultures. I'm not sure why that would be the case. He makes the assumption that it's parallel because it's, somewhat close. Okay. And he says, however, the scope and size of the campaign is so much that I cannot create and run it all. Therefore, I am putting it on a national basis so as to get the entire campaign running. I need 55 dungeon masters with time and good judgment who are willing to run an area about 600 by 600 miles. Each DM would gather up about 20 players, fill in any needed terrain and dungeons, and run that section, sending me monthly reports to keep the campaign up to date. Those who are interested, write to this address, and he gives his address here, Keith Abbott. Okay. And then he says, I hope that this campaign will prove to be a melting pot of ideas, sort of a Dungeon Masters Union, and although I may get the help that I need from the 55, I'm planning to expand. So any and all applications will be filled, providing that I receive the mailing address of the applicant. I will then send an introductory letter to explain the campaign further. And if they are still interested, I will send a supplement to use with the Loeran campaign. I hope that the Loeran campaign will be successful. It's a world of ideas. May your treasures always be plentiful. And then signs his name, Keith A. Abbott. So this is really interesting for a few reasons. So first off, kind of not necessarily related to this campaign, but if you see here the use of the word Dungeon Master, now he doesn't put a space in between, it's mashed together. That is the first time the word Dungeon Master appears in Dragon Magazine. So again, this is March of 1977. It had appeared as a term in, I think it was Eldritch Wizardry, 1976. But the first use of it seems to be, at least first published one that's widely distributed published, seems to be Tunnels and Trolls from 1975. So it's just an interesting thing that term Dungeon Master, which is now, I believe, trademarked or copyright, whatever the term, by Wizards of the Coast, actually debuted in another game in a rival game, Tunnels and Trolls. However, it's just interesting for the time because again, you're seeing it here in Dragon Magazine for the first time. And so, to us now that term is ubiquitous, but one of the reasons that I always say referee, I always kind of say Dungeon Master or referee, is because originally they were either called referees or judges. And the game that I'm running for my daughter, which is Old School Essentials, it's based on the 1981 basic D&D set, and Old School Essentials calls them referees. So anyway, I think that's interesting. However, the bigger issue from this is that this article that he writes in here is going to be the first of a few different times that Keith is going to be talking about this massive campaign that he's going to be running and asking for help for Dungeon Masters. He ends up taking out ads in some different magazines and fanzines. And there is a supplement now. I haven't seen it, unfortunately. The Loewen supplement that talks about how, like his house rules. Essentially, it's like a booklet that talks about the house rules that he's using to run this Dungeons and Dragons campaign. The mechanics are D&D, but he changes some things like leveling and things like that. So this is, I think, from what most people have said, John Peterson has actually an article on his blog from a number of years ago where he talked about this. And I actually hadn't seen that when I saw this article. So what prompted me to look this up was I saw this article in here and I thought, this seems interesting. Like, this is a very early example of somebody talking about running a D&D campaign. And this is what they'd call play by post or play by mail, PBM, where people would be writing things into this person and he would be organizing what they're doing in their games to run this campaign. That's how this would work. And this seems to be one of the first examples of somebody talking about that in advertising as to get people. And so when I was looking up the name of this person, Keith Abbott, and in conjunction with this Loera campaign, because I thought, like, I wonder if it ever took off, like what happened. And lo and behold, I stumbled upon this old article on John Peterson's blog where he did talk about it. He actually has some images there, and it looks like he might have a copy of the Loera supplement. All he does is share the cover. But he does reference some of the contents. So, which is kind of cool. But I just thought that was interesting that, now we have the, massively multiplayer online role-playing games, World of Warcraft, etc. So those ideas came out of these early play-by-mail games. And again, this one looks to me to be the first example of somebody doing this and trying to get people to play. All right. So that's our look at that. I thought that's an interesting piece of, history of the hobby and of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay. So that's going to do it for those first, 4 sections, kind of the big topics you could say. But I did want to go back and dive into the specifics of Dragon Magazine's number 4 and 5. Now, if you're enjoying this kind of D&D history or role-playing game history, please make sure to like this video and then subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon to be notified. And I guess there's a new feature. Even if you hit notifications, there's like a second step you have to do to hit all. Otherwise, YouTube might not let you know that I have a video out, even though you've hit notifications. I don't know why they're doing that now, but in any event, I would appreciate it. So I'm going to dive in now. This is the cover of Dragon Magazine number 4. I think it's a pretty striking cover, partially just because of the color, this kind of like orange-red color. Now, this art, turns out, is by Professor M.A.R. Barker. I've talked about him before, but this issue is pretty much going to be dedicated to the game Empire of the Petal Throne. I have a whole video on Empire of the Petal Throne, so you can see more there and learn a little bit about that game and its history. So the world of, it's called Tecumel, actually predates Dungeons and Dragons. The guy was working on it as, a young person. He was a linguist, a professor of languages, I guess, and invented, very much like Tolkien, invented his own languages and then, kind of needed a setting to place them. And so he created this setting. So partially because of that, there's a lot of people that will try to compare Tecumel and Tolkien's Middle-earth. And they're very, very different. And the two men were very, very different people as well. So in any event, that's the cover. So now we're going to see this opening spread here. So we see over here on the left, in cooperation with TSR Hobbies, William Murray is presenting the Legions of the Petal Throne. So these are miniature figures that you could use with the game. So there was a role-playing game for Empire of the Petal Throne published in 1975, and it was based like mechanically on Dungeons and Dragons, but there actually is a version that predates the publication of D&D from 1974. It didn't get a huge distribution with its published that was published because it was like self-published, I think. But once Professor Barker had been exposed to Dungeons and Dragons and the people at TSR kind of saw what he was doing, they had him redo the game, and he did it kind of based on the D&D engine. There's some changes. We've talked all about this before, but Professor Barker kind of moved in the circles that the Minneapolis game players were playing in, the Minneapolis Twin Cities group. That's the Dave Arneson group. And then, but he also kind of worked with their, interacted with the Lake Geneva game group. All right. So anyway, these are the miniatures that are coming out. And so you see here, TSR Hobbies. This is the lizard logo that they're using at this time. And now we have over here on the right, this is the editorial by Tim Kask. And he does remember Tim Kask is the first employee of TSR. So not someone who founded the company or, put money in, but the first actual employee. So he says, when dealing with a game as special as Empire of the Battlethrone, it's really difficult to choose a good place to begin. Basically, what he says is that he wasn't able to cut this magazine down. So he's going to expand it from their normal 28 pages. He's going to expand it to 32. Because he had so much content that he had to try to fit in. And also because of that, there were things that he had to cut out of this particular issue that normally would be in here in order to make room for all these articles on Empire of the Battlethrone. Now, what's interesting is he says, we're going to return everything else to normal with the next issue. It says, as you see here at the end of this first paragraph, it says, we'll revert to the old size. He actually doesn't. So the next issue goes back, and it's when the next issue is published, it's the exact same length as this one. So very common thing that's going to happen in these early days of Dragon Magazine is because partially they're coming out and it's taking so long between each issue, because remember, at this period of time, Dragon's not being published every month, it's being published every other month. There's so much that's changing in between issues that a lot of times they'll say they're going to do things and then they don't. And so as an example here, he says, we're going to go back to our normal, we're not going to have the extra 4 pages. We're going to go back to our normal page count. And then he doesn't. And he doesn't even explain it. It just happens. Same thing with, like I talked about, Out on a Limb missing for like almost 2 years in the magazine. What's interesting, he says like, there's times where he'll say like, we plan to, we're bringing it back next month. And then that next month he says, because of changes that happen, we didn't get to it, but we'll bring it back to next month. And then it still doesn't come back. It's like over and over and over again that this happens. So just very common. But anyway, he talks about this and says that EPT, Empire of the Battlethrone, is a culmination of a lifetime of working on what started out as a childhood invention. I just talked about that. And in the course of evaluating the world of Tekkamel, certain comparisons are escapable. And so he said, for one thing, it is the ultimate in terms of a D&D campaign. So that was kind of a big thing at the time, that it was a setting and a game. And so again, it wasn't necessarily 100% compatible with D&D, but it was like 99%. It was very, very close. Some different ability scores, different, species. They didn't have, it doesn't have elves, dwarves, and hobbits. It has like a whole bunch of other ones with names that I can't pronounce. Very common in Tekkamel and Empire of the Battlethrone is this language, because that was a big part of it. But to the, if you're an English speaker and you look at that, it looks like almost impossible to pronounce. But anyway, it has these different species in there. And as I recall, in the game, there are no thieves. It's just magic users fighting men and clerics. All right. But then he says, once it's been studied, other comparison is inevitable, which is between that and Tolkien's Middle Earth. I just talked about this as well. And he said, now I'm not comparing EPT to his novels, but rather to the mythos. So the idea of like languages and alphabets and grammar and all that kind of stuff. So he's talking about this. And he says, Tolkien's Elvish has acquired a cult-like following of linguists. And he says, it's reasonable to assume that someday the same will be true of the EPT languages. That is not true as far as I know. I mean, I think there's more people that speak Klingon than there are that speak any of the EPT languages, like on a regular basis. So, but I can see why Tim Kask thought that at the time, because there was a strong push for this game. It's the second game that TSR publishes, role-playing game that they publish after Dungeons and Dragons, and they push it for quite a few of these early issues in Dragon Magazine, and then it kind of just fades away. I think it just maybe didn't catch on like they were hoping. It is a little complicated when you look at it. It looks intimidating because of the languages and things like that. And of course, I've mentioned this before, but before someone comes into the comments, after Professor Barker died, we learned later on about some just horrible things that he said. And it's not just, this isn't the standard, like people, say, oh, it's cancel culture kind of thing. I understand that point of view, but what he said is just indefensible. And it's very well documented. And even the TechML Foundation is like, we don't have anything to do with that. We don't want anything to do with that. So I only mention that so that people don't think that I'm trying to promote those viewpoints, because I find them abhorrent, but more just to talk about, again, the history of EPT in the gaming, industry, in the history of role-playing games. It's very important. Now, all that is to basically just come back and say that this entire issue is almost going to be focused on EPT. There's other stuff in here, but for the most part. Now, you see here, reports submitted to the Palphone. Now, what's interesting here, this is on the left-hand side. What's interesting here is that he's talking about this idea, and he says in the final issue of the Strategic Review, Volume 2, Number 2, that's number 7, an article was published which provided news about doings on TechML, the world of the Petal Throne. This created enough interest in the part of referees and players to call for a second installment, and a number of referees have sent in reports of doings in their own campaigns with requests to include those in further submissions to the Imperium. So people are writing in telling Professor Barker or to the magazine, this is what I'm doing in my EPT game. This is what happened. Can you please publish this so people know? And this was the thing, I think, that a lot of people kind of had trouble wrapping their heads around, this idea that you could do things in your game that didn't matter to anybody else that was playing in that same setting. So once you get the setting, you're making it your own, you're doing your own things, and you are not beholden to what other people are doing. But back then, the idea that you could tell someone, in my campaign, this happened, and so you should incorporate that into your game, because they're getting this feeling that they are contributing to the setting. And so he says, as an example here, he talks about somebody who wrote in and talked about how the emperor died, and there was like this fight for who was going to take over and become, and it was like the daughter of this person, and she's the first empress, but there's like this other guy out there that's fighting. And so this person's like, can you include that in your next imperial report as something official that happened in the game? That's the implication of what they're asking. So again, you could kind of look now, had they done that, you could kind of look at this as being the start of like this massive multiplayer game, right? It didn't go that way, but you're seeing the seeds of this, and this is the issue before that other one that we just talked about, that Loera game. But it is really interesting that people are kind of talking about this, and again, this idea that what happens in their game might be able to influence what other people are doing. It's just so foreign to the way that we play now. So this miniature ad for a miniature over here on the right hand side, this dragon looks pretty cool. All right, so now this is all reports from Professor Barker. These pages here, this article is him talking about what is happening in the world, basically. So it's sort of like now how like, Wizards of the Coast will come up with a new edition of, setting like Forgotten Realms, and they'll change the timeline, and then they'll write all these things like, this is what's happened. So if you want to play in the realms now, you have to catch up, and these things have happened. And it has ticked a lot of people off who don't implement all those changes, and they want things to kind of stay static a little bit, which I do understand that. But these articles are basically telling you like, this is what's been going on. So if you're playing in TechML, know that like these things have happened as far as like battles that have been fought and blah, 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 right? It's very, very detailed, very, very long. And so that article ends. Now, here we see down here on the bottom left-hand corner, it says D&D Day, Games Workshop presents at Fulham Town Hall in Harwood Road, London. So remember, at this period of time, and I have a whole video on this, if you're interested in the history of TSR's UK division and how it intersects with Games Workshop, you're going to want to watch that video. But for a while, Games Workshop, which now we think of as like Warhammer, that's kind of like just how we, or maybe Blood Bowl and things like that. But like, that's what we think of them. But when they started out, they were the official distributors and publishers of D&D content in the UK. So the Fiend Folio, which was an advanced Dungeons and Dragons hardback book, started out as being, well, it is a collection of creatures from magazines that were being published by Games Workshop, but White Dwarf magazine. It eventually it's just published by TSR, but for a while it was supposed to be published by, Games Workshop. Okay. So, an official D&D supplement, but because remember, Games Workshop was the official D&D, supplier in the UK. So that Holmes Basic set that I talked about earlier, that blue box, they distribute that with an entirely new cover. The contents were the same, but they decided that cover wasn't going to work with their audience in the UK, and they did a completely new cover for that book, and they had that power to do that. All right, but I just thought that's a little interesting thing to point out. Now, here in this middle column, we're seeing that we're dungeon masters again. So very early on. So as far as like, now this is an ad from another company. So when I said earlier that issue 5, that article or that letter is the first mention of Dungeon Masters in Dragon Magazine, I'm talking about like as an article. This is an ad, and it's an ad well, it's not technically, it is for another company, even though they were creating stuff that was for D&D. So I've talked a little bit about Judges Guild and early supplements before. I have a whole video on early tabletop role-playing game. I call them tabletop role-playing game aids because that's what they were called. And then YouTube flagged my video because thinking I was talking about the disease, even though I didn't spell it the same way. All right. So over here on the right-hand side, we have this ad for minifigs. And you see, even though this is a fantasy, science fiction, and sword and sorcery magazine, as Tim Cass describes it, these miniature figure ads are going back to kind of like the medieval and specifically like the Napoleonic era. So you see like Russian infantry, Russian cavalry, because people were playing Napoleonics. That was a big deal back then. So that's still part of this community. You see here, it even says Napoleonic armies, 30 years war on the top there. All right. So now we're going to go here. One of the few non-Tecumel or non-Empire of the Petal Throne articles in this magazine is over here on the left. And this is Notes on Androids on the Starship Warden. So this is by James Ward, who is the creator of Metamorphosis Alpha. So you see here it says Designers for Metamorphosis Alpha. I have a whole video right after James Ward passed away, which is somewhat recently. I think I want to say, it might have even been March or April that he passed away. It's now May of 2024, so recently. And I have a whole video on James Ward and his contributions to role-playing games, so you can learn more about that there. But he was using Dragon Magazine to expand on what he'd written in Metamorphosis Alpha. So that game, unlike D&D, that was a box set of like 3 books, the Metamorphosis Alpha game is just a slim notebook. And I think as time went on, James realized that there were things that he hadn't included in there that he would wanted to. And so he starts using Dragon Magazine as his saying like, this should be part of the game. Now, what's interesting is because they're written by James Ward, you could consider that to be official content for Metamorphosis Alpha, even though it's being published in the magazine. All right, now over here on the right, you see this Jakala Encounters. Now, this is an Empire of the Petal Throne article. Just talking about different encounter types that you might see. And then there's this whole piece of artwork here. So this, these symbols and stuff, this is part of that writing, very similar to what we saw on the cover of Empire of the Petal Throne. Okay. So now this is the Battle of the Temple of Chanus. This is by Professor M.A.R. Barker. And so he's talking about a miniature battle that happens. So you see here, it says players of the Empire of the Petal Throne have indicated a strong interest in fighting some of Tecumel's battles in miniature. So the necessary figures are now being produced by the old guard. Those were those ones that we saw on the inside front cover of the magazine. I showed those to you already. And judging from the prototypes, they will be splendid. And he says, and tactical battle rules are also nearly ready. So that was another thing that eventually is going to come out for Empire of the Petal Throne, very similar to like Chainmail, which predates D&D, or Swords and Spells, which was a supplement written for how to conduct miniature war games within the D&D kind of system. They came out with a miniatures system, or miniatures battles, war games rules for Empire of the Petal Throne. So he's talking about that. But this whole article is basically a summary of a battle that happened in miniature, and then he goes on and talks about how to do it yourself. So you see here, there's a map on how to do that, and then he's got the key to the map. So this is all for people that want to replicate this battle with miniatures in Tecumel. And it's so long, and the text is just so dense, no breaks, and so there's paragraph breaks, but like there's no art. There's just nothing to break this up. And so it's, and the type is just so small. But in any event, that is that article. Okay. So then we're going to get to the creature feature. And now in this particular case, these are creatures that are for Tecumel. And so I assume that these were created by M.A.R. Barker. Again, there's no indication of who created these, who wrote this article, but I assume that that's who did it. Okay, so you have that, and then we have another ad here for some miniatures that are coming out from a completely different company. This is Heritage Models, very famous miniatures company. Now over here on the right, you have miscellaneous treasure, magic, weapons, artifacts, and monsters. Additions, deletions, omissions, corrections, changes, variations, and otherwise confusing alterations. So if that title doesn't give you a clue, this is a humorous article, which is something that we're starting to see more and more in Dragon, is people are writing these like, humorous, coming up with ideas like classes or spells or whatever that are humorous. And that's what is happening here. This is by Gary, I want to say Jacket, who is going to end up being an editor at Dragon at some point. But he has monsters like the creeping crud found in all D&D playing areas, resembles cigarette butts, crushed Fritos, spilled Dr. Pepper, sweat from players' foreheads and referees' dice wrung arm, pencil shaving as old character cards, can cause extensive damage as a result of wrath incurred from janitors, mothers, and wives. Minute lice, which breed in and inhabit dice pips. The added, that's a whole different thing. That's dice lice. Okay, so he's making fun of players in this. So it's tongue in cheek, but it's very much like self-deprecating humor, and it's just funny that even very early on, this idea that like people were eating chips and drinking soda while they're playing D&D is in there. So I'm not going to go through all these. You can kind of see them here, but he lists them all. Now, this is the end of the monster from the previous page. You have an ad here for an early play-by-mail game, Starweb by Flying Buffalo, who kind of made their name with play-by-mail games. That's where they sort of started, and it was their bread and butter for the longest time. Now we have some fiction here, Roads from Jakala. Again, fiction taking place in the world of Tecumel. There's this cartoon here, Dirt, which is going to run through the first few issues of Dragon. It says by Jake. I'm assuming, actually don't remember who that is. So I think I talked about it before in one of my earlier videos. I just don't remember off the top of my head. There's an ad here for a place selling fantasy and science fiction games, books, and records, which I think is funny. They've got 1,500 books, 50 conflict simulation games, and 24 record albums. So I don't know what kind of records these are, but it's just kind of funny. If anybody knows or shopped there, leave a comment. I'd love to hear about it. So this is a continuation of, this is Interplayer, actually, instructional memo to all D&D participants from Department of Definition, subject magic user character definement. And it says supersedes all previous draft. So it basically says like, it's again, this is humor. 22nd level wizard can leap tall buildings in a single bound, more powerful than locomotive, faster than a speeding bullet, walks on. So everything related to Superman, right? And then it says like, but your 14th level wizard can leap short buildings, is more powerful than a switch locomotive, and is as fast as a speeding bullet. And then a wizard, because remember, these are level titles. So wizard leaps short buildings with a running start and good winds, and is almost as powerful as a switch locomotive and faster than a speeding, like a BB gun. Sorcerer, again, level titles. Enchanter, Conjure, Medium being the least, falls over the doorstep when trying to enter a building. Wets himself with his water pistol. It's just goofy, and it's just this is just a column filler here. And then it says like the referee is God, essentially. So again, the dungeon master. Mapping the dungeons. This is where again you're sharing names of people that play D&D in case you wanted to meet up with them to play. And then it says be sure to specify D&D or EPT or both. So I think the idea at this time was that EPT was, again, because it was like I think it's the second game that TSR published, the second role-playing game. I think there was this idea that it was going to take off and be really popular, and so they needed to specify. So of names in here, we have talked about this before, but the big one to kind of point out would be Alan Hammock, who ends up working at TSR and on a lot of different projects in the early days. Okay, so then we see Wizards and Warriors. These are miniatures by Grenadier. So lots of miniature ads, as you see in here. Not so many for games, but lots for miniatures. Now, this is a review of different miniatures. And so this is about those Legion of the Paddle Throne. So it goes back into that, as well as talking about D&D figure lines. So these are hobgoblins. The reproduction quality in this is terrible. And it doesn't help that they're black and white photos. But these are hobgoblins. This is an orc, kobolds, dwarves. Okay, so there's more orcs here, and then these are your EPT models. And again, I'm not even going to try to pronounce these names. Okay. Oh, this is very, very interesting. So I wanted to point this out. This is a short article by Gary Gygax on fantasy, swords, and sorcery recommended reading. This predates what he's going to publish in Appendix N, the famous Appendix N of the Dungeon Master's Guide, which we have talked about before. But he goes through these authors and says, like, these are the things that you should read. Now, here's what's interesting. All of these are going to appear in Appendix N, except for Algernon Blackwood. Now, Algernon Blackwood was a very, very early on and famous what they called weird fiction writer. And H.P. Lovecraft actually said that he would like one of his stories, which is called The Willows. He said that it was the best weird tale of all time. That's what H.P. Lovecraft said. They were contemporaries. So it is interesting that Gary removes him from the list. But there's a bunch that are going to be in Appendix N that aren't on this list. Like John Bellairs, Frederick Brown, August Derleth, Lord Dunsany, Andre Norton, Andrew J. Offutt, and Jack Williamson. So those are the main ones that aren't on this list. But this is a very early look at what an Appendix N could have looked like. Then you have your cartoons here. You've got Phineas Fingers. We've talked about that before. We've got some treasure types here, a table for Empire of the Petal Throne. This is an article on how to build an actual life-size model of Empire of the Petal Throne stuff. So he talks about that there. You've got some more ads here, including an ad for Metamorphosis Alpha on the right, had just come out, and then a look at what's going to come ahead. So that's our look at Dragon Magazine issue number 4. All right, and now we're going to look at Dragon Magazine number 5. This is from March of 1977. And what's interesting is that at this point, Dragon Magazine is supposed to be published every other month. However, we saw that issue number 4 was from December of 1976, so there's a little bit more of a lag here. But in any event, that's not going to last for long. We're going to talk about that in a second. So we see this again, a pretty cool cover here. This is this cover art is by David Sutherland III, DCS, David C. Sutherland, and he is doing. Again, this might look like Conan, but this is actually the main character from a series of it's a fantasy story that Gardner Fox has been talking about in Dragon Magazine's been writing about. And the story debuted a few issues before, and we already talked about that. We've already talked about Gardner Fox, very famous comic book writer and fantasy fiction author. But in any event, so this is not Conan. This is that other character. Okay, so let's just dive into it. So here we see on the inside left front cover, this is an ad for Gen Con. So Gen Con 10 at this point is coming up in August 1977. And then over here, the Dragon Rumbles, this is where Tim Cass kind of writes his editorial comment. So he talks about how there's been a blizzard this winter. And then he said a month or two ago, he placed a listing in their Writer's Digest asking for people to write in with stories for science fiction, fantasy, and sword and sorcery. And apparently he's just been deluged with people. And so he's actually hired Gary Jackett. We've talked about him before. Hired is the wrong word. Gary Jackett has been voluntold that he's going to be the associate fantasy editor for all these things so that he can go through them. And Tim kind of goes on and says, a lot of them are really good, but it's not quite what we want to publish. And so we're trying to see. And then he talks about there's a possibility that they might end up publishing down the line, another magazine, or maybe not monthly, or something where they're going to do the fiction that they get. And then he asks people let us know if that's something that you want. And then he said, so far he says that the magazine has kind of been focused on D&D and Empire of the Petal Throne, which I think is interesting because there's a lot of Metamorphosis Alpha in here too. But I guess, if you looked at total number of pages, it probably is D&D and EPT. But then he said, we recognize that D&D started the fantasy gaming genre, but there's a number of science fiction fantasy games now available. And so this is Tim Castley. He was very specific in his sort of mission for Dragon Magazine that he did not want it to become what they call a house organ, where they only talked about TSR games. He was very clear that he wanted this to be bigger than that. And so he's saying there's games out there like Stellar Conquest, the Yithri, which I've never heard of, WBRM, God's Fire, Starship Troopers. Interesting enough, I actually have that old Starship Troopers game from the 70s. It's a war game. It's not miniatures, but it's a war game, I guess you could say. Strategy game. Outreach, Sorcerer, Star Soldier. So anyway, he goes on and on, talks about all these other games out there, and he wants people writing articles about those games. So that was sort of his mission. Okay, so, and then he said, again, they got so much fantasy fiction, and we talked about that. And then he said he's saving the best news for last, that Dragon is expanding to 8 issues per year. So it was currently 6, because remember, the idea was when the strategic review folded and it was reorganized into 2 different publications. Dragon, which focused on fantasy, science fiction, sword and sorcery. That's how Tim Kask says it. And then Little Wars was going to be focused on those like miniatures war games. So, and they went every other month. So Dragon 1 and then Little Wars back and forth, right? Well, Little Wars hasn't had the reception at this point that Dragon did. So Tim talks about that. So he's going to reduce Little Wars to being essentially quarterly. So it's going to go from 6 issues a year to 4. And he's going to expand the page count for those 4 issues, but it's going to be cut. And then the 2 issues that it's no longer being published, those are now going to be issues of Dragon. So we see here that Dragon is growing and growing and growing. And this idea, like the war games, which is where all this kind of started, is not getting the traction, because you're getting, at this point, just a few years in, you're getting people that don't have a background in war games at all, that are getting into Dungeons and Dragons. It's created its own genre of games. It's not just a subset of war games. It's now its own thing, and it's becoming more popular more quickly. All right. So that's this article. You can see here again, we talked about the staff artist is Dave Sutherland, as well as the cover. We talked about that. So this is that witchcraft supplement. We already went through this. So this is going to be pretty quick going through, because we've already covered a lot of the things that I wanted to talk about in this specific issue. But that was the article on witches. Now, what we see here again, going back to this idea of these Metamorphosis Alpha editions. And then it says some ideas missed in Metamorphosis Alpha. That's what I was talking about before. So this is by the creator of the game. And he's saying, in the course of writing about anything, when everything is done and sent to the printers, there's something that should have been added or changed. So I'm very familiar with that. And then he says, such is the case in looking over the TSR booklet, Metamorphosis Alpha. And so he says, it's not anyone at TSR's fault. I just felt like I should have added it and I forgot or whatever. And so he says, in working on the technological treasure items list, these are the 4 items that should have been completely explained that were not. And then he talks about chemical radiation neutralizers, chemical flammable retardants, which is like a fire extinguisher, radioactive material in containers, and then sensory intensifiers. So he just goes through that and how they work in the game. And then you see there's the designers forum, and this is tribal society and hierarchy on board the Starship Warden. So this is kind of interesting. He basically talks about how every tribe is going to have a shaman that leads them. And then there's 2 sort of factions on the Starship Warden that are sort of vying for supremacy. And it's the androids and it's the wolfoids. Now, why wolfoids as opposed to any other animal type, I don't know. So wolfoids are essentially like, human wolf hybrids. So that most of the mutants or creatures on the Starship Warden are that. It's very much like Island of Dr. Moreau kind of thing. So, but he says like it's the androids and the wolfoids that are trying to get like the upper hand. And the androids do things by like sneaking into different groups, different societies, because people don't know that they're androids. And so they will like replace a shaman with an android and then have the tribe do things that the android wants, and everyone's doing it because that's what the shaman says. It's a very interesting sort of interaction with these different groups. And then like the wolfoids are aware of the androids, but most other people aren't. It's, again, it's I guess it's kind of interesting if you're into playing that type of way. All right, then we have this ad here again, Grenadier. We've seen that ad before. Here's the Ankheg we talked about. Here's Out on the Limb that we talked about before. We talked about that one letter that was written in about the Massive Multiplayer game. But then this person here, this first one is basically talking about how Lou Pulsifer had written an article or written a note or like a letter in a previous issue saying that the fiction was pointless. There's no point having fiction in Dragon. And this person says, I completely disagree. The fiction is great for inspiration. And then you see Tim Kask here says, hear, hear. So because Tim was really big, I wanted to have fiction in Dragon Magazine. So then there's some more articles in here where people are just talking about, things that they liked about the magazine. So this guy says, I want to congratulate you on the magazine, even though I don't use a lot of it. This one here, this one in the middle, he's basically talking about the idea that you can start to add so much material, like different classes and subclasses and things, where the game becomes unwieldy, which is just funny that they were complaining about this 3 years into the game being published. And that's something that people still complain about today. Like, how many rules and classes and spells and feats and all that stuff do you actually need? And this guy was saying, like, Dragon could get out of control very quickly if it keeps adding this stuff. And then the response from Tim is basically like, everything in here is optional and you can use whatever you want. So there's that. And then this other letter here. This was about the elf system that was proposed. So if you saw one of my previous videos on Dragon Magazine, I forget the name of the guy, but he was sort of like TSR's Tolkien expert. And he wrote this article talking about the different types of Tolkien elves and how they would map to the D&D system. And it's where you first start to see the idea of elves having different sub races, which became very common, especially like in first and second edition era, where there was, wood elves and sylvan elves and like high elves and gray elves and valley elves and dark elves and sea elves and all this kind of stuff. Right. And so a lot of that came from that first article in Dragon, where the idea that you could have a different kind of elf and those different kind of elves might have different abilities. That's where it came from. And basically this guy is saying he doesn't agree with that article and then proposes his own system. And it's very detailed and he talks about it. And then you see here, Tim Kask just says, sounds good to me. Any objections? Because again, it's pretty detailed, more so than it really needs to be. Okay. And then you have this thing here about to the average war gamer, regardless of his area of interest, the entertainment or pleasurable aspect as well. Okay. So in any event, he starts to break out the types of players that there are. There's the so-so fans, and then there's the fanatic. And then there's the newcomer is like the money monster that just wants to buy everything. And so he talks about that. So this is written by Gary F. Spiegel, this particular letter. Now, Gary had written in before in issue number 3. He had a letter. So I don't know how prolific he's going to be with his letters, but this is at least the second one that we've seen by him. Okay, so again, same ad we saw before in the other one for the minifigs. Another article on Metamorphosis Alpha. Now, this one is by Gary Gygax. I have talked about this specific article before because this one was reprinted in Best of Dragon Volume 1, which is, again, where I first saw it. And I love this article, partly just because the artwork was very eye-catching. But this table is basically showing you how to do different skin and hair colorations and characteristics and like shapes of your head and your neck and your body and your facial features and your hands and feet and fingers and toes. And for your mutant characters and so it says humanoids, they're mutants, mutant humans or humanoids. And I used this for my Gamma World game because at the time when I first saw this, I didn't have Metamorphosis Alpha. Getting Best of Dragon Volume 1 was the first time I'd even heard that there was a game called Metamorphosis Alpha. And I spent about 20 years looking for a copy before I finally tracked one down when eBay became a thing. So that is that article, which again, I think is kind of a fun article. So this is that continued story by Gardner Fox, Beyond the Wizard Fog. So kind of, it's a sword and sorcery story. And again, this was a big get. Like, you might not know who Gardner Fox is now, but he was a very prolific writer. And again, he created some of the most popular comic book characters that you would know of. So, and I talked all about that before, so see that video. But many of the, mainly DC characters that you've heard of were created by Gardner Fox. So this is the story. So the guy's name is Niall. I couldn't think of his name earlier when we talked about the cover, Niall. All right. So again, very long story that's taking up a lot of pages in here with very little art. Okay. Now, this is Wizard Research Rules by Charles Preston Goforth Jr. So I did look him up also because I thought, oh, that name's pretty unique. Surprisingly enough, there are a few different Charles Preston Goforths out there. I don't know if they're all related. They don't all live in the same place. This guy is listed in like the RPG Net or RPG Geek. I forget which one, but he's listed as a creator, like an RPG creator. However, this is the only thing that he has to his name in those things. So I don't think that beyond this article that he did any other creation in the industry, but I did try to check that out. But this is an interesting thing about how to do research if you're a wizard. And it talks about the following rules are designed to supplement the research rules found in Men and Magic, which is the first, book 1 of the 3-book set of original Dungeons and Dragons. There's that cool dragon figure again. And again, that article on the wizard research, it's pretty long. It's pretty detailed. Again, we've already talked about this one. The Gandalf was the 5th level magic user. That was at the front of the video. All right. And then this is kind of your grab bag page where it's like the, creature features continuing here, wizard research, and then the witch covens is all here, as well as we're seeing ads for enjoy historical gaming. So they're really trying to get you to subscribe to Little Wars because, again, I think it just was doing this well. And so they were trying to try to get people like, a crossover audience, which I think over time there's just not going to be one. So, or at least not to the extent that it would have started out with. Now, this is the continuation of the Gnome Cache by, quote unquote, Garrison Ernst. This is Gary Gygax. We talked about that before. So this was the story that he was writing in here. And so this continues, goes a little bit. There's some art down here. And then again, our ad from Metamorphosis Alpha, and then the back cover promising what's coming next, the Mongol army, Forest of Flame, an illustrated tale, and then talking about solo war gamers, more articles for Metamorphosis Alpha, an artillery evaluation for wargaming, America's Stonehenge, Mystery Hill, a Viking Saxon Demi campaign, and then a painting guide for Legion of Petalthrone figures. So that's going to be it for this particular issue of Dragon Magazine. And that's also going to be it for this video. So I hope you enjoyed this look. I think that those 4 things that I pointed out at the beginning are really interesting ideas in the development of the role-playing game hobby. So the witches and the, the first multiplayer game being talked about, massively multiplayer game, the debut of an iconic creature and all that kind of stuff. So I hope that you enjoyed that part of the video, as well as the rest of us getting into some details on these magazines. And please leave a comment. Let me know. Let me know again, if you like this format. Do you like me covering 2 issues at once? So, I go back and forth with this. Some people say my videos are too long, but and those people just don't watch, and that's totally fine. I get that I have sort of a niche and it is not the quick, 8-minute videos. And I've heard people say, like, don't change my format. Like, I've made like a name for myself with these long videos. So, but let me know, if you'd prefer that I would spend more time on each particular issue. I just think it will take me forever to get through these. So, let me know about that. And then after you comment, you'll see links down below as well, where you can find me on social media. You can find me on my blog, and you'll see a link to where you can, again, join the pre-launch Kickstarter page for my book that is going to be coming out in less than a week now. So today is May 28th, and my book is going to launch on Kickstarter on June 3rd, my supplement on expert and specialist characters. So please do check that out and sign up for the pre-launch page to be notified when it goes live. And with that said, I'd like to thank you so very much for watching this video. Happy gaming, stay safe, and I will talk to you next time. Now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to while I made my notes for this album. I'd also like to shout out really quickly to everybody who does watch the bonus content, just to say thanks. I really appreciate you guys hanging out through this part. I have a lot of fun putting this part of the video together. I actually record my videos in order, and so this is always the last thing that I do, and it's kind of a chance for me to kind of just, maybe relax a little bit after the intense amount of detail that I'm trying to put into the rest of my videos. So we had for dinner, my wife made some Filipino food just recently. So she made some adobo, and I like to try to, I've talked about this before, match the drink to the food. Now at Christmas, so about 5 months ago, at our annual Christmas party, it was themed Filipino night. So we do like different themes every year. And so at the time, I had bought some liqueurs and liquors that I don't normally have. Filipino culture is, I wouldn't say necessarily known for their drinking. So, but I did some research and I found a couple of things. So one is this bottle. It's called Lambanog, and it is a distilled coconut liqueur, or liquor. It's not a liqueur. This is essentially like a coconut vodka. The coconut, again, you can make vodka from pretty much anything. The idea is that you're having a clear, distilled spirit that is supposed to be distilled enough to where you can't always necessarily taste the original ingredients. So just like you'd say, Russian vodka doesn't taste like potatoes, I wouldn't say this tastes like coconut. It's just made with coconut. However, that said, there's just a faint hint of coconut. Now you might smell it strong. I don't have the world's best sense of smell, just due to sinus issues. But in any event, this is Lambanog, and then I think I've shown this one before on the channel. But this is a Manil, from Manila, liqueur de calamansi. Calamansi is a fruit, a citrus fruit. That's got kind of, orange lime flavors to it a little bit. So all I did, very, very simple. I just mixed not quite equal parts, like 2-to-1. I went a little stronger on the Lambanog because the calamansi liqueur is a little sweet to me. So, and then I'm just making a little spritz. That's what I did when I was doing this last night. So I just, I wanted something that's super easy drinking. These are typically called tall drinks when you lengthen a drink with soda. It is referred to in cocktail parlance as a tall drink. So that's all that I was doing. So a little kind of bubbly thing to keep me company while I was working on my notes. And what I was listening to. So again, trying to mix it up a little bit. And I'm going to get back to jazz pretty soon just because the majority of my collection is jazz, but wanted to talk about, some other things. This is a great album by Bright Eyes. This is I'm Wide Awake, It's Morning. It came out in 2005. And so what's interesting is that this is artwork that came with my particular package. So the actual album doesn't look like that. But this album, again, released in 2005, came out on the exact same day as another album by them. So their 6th and 7th albums came out the same day. The other album is called Digital Ash and a Digital Urn, and it was like more electronic type music. This is more, I guess you could call it folk rock. However you want to say that, indie, whatever. Sometimes these things just get too hard to categorize, but it's just a really kind of fun album. It's very, I would say, indicative of the time period that it came out. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just, there was kind of that period where there was sort of, I feel like a lot of music that was, or even shortly after this came out, that kind of sounds like that. Now, this album actually sold really well. It was a top Billboard chart. Both albums hit in the top 20, I believe, if I remember correctly. And sort of, again, these are like the 6th and 7th albums from the band, but these are the ones that sort of made Bright Eyes kind of more popular, where people kind of heard of them more. Over 500,000 copies of this particular album have sold, which is a pretty big deal. So, and anyway, if it's something that you haven't heard before, definitely give it a try. It's on Spotify and things like that. If you are not going analog and old school like I am. So enjoy and cheers. Thanks again for watching, and I will talk to you next time.